What if death wasn't the end, but just the beginning of something far greater? On his final day, legendary actor Gene Hackman took what he thought was his last breath. But instead of fading into nothingness, he found himself pulled into a realm beyond time, where familiar faces, forgotten memories, and a presence more powerful than anything he had ever known awaited him. What did he see? Who did he meet? And what message did he bring back? Stay with me as we uncover Gene Hackman's incredible journey beyond the veil. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quiet Santa Fe estate. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of desert sage through the open windows. Inside, Gene Hackman sat in his favorite armchair, a book resting on his lap. He wasn't reading, though. His eyes wandered across the room, pausing on the framed photographs lining the shelves. Snapshots of a life well lived. His hands, once strong and steady, now trembled slightly as he reached for a cup of tea. His wife, Betsy, was in the next room, humming softly as she tended to their 3 beloved dogs. The house was peaceful, filled with the gentle sounds of a life settled into quiet contentment. Gene had lived many lives. He had been an actor, a storyteller, a husband, and a friend. His career spanned decades, filled with roles that made people laugh, cry, and reflect. Yet in this moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was the warmth of the afternoon light on his skin, the distant melody of his wife's voice, and the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat, until that rhythm began to slow. A strange feeling crept over him. Not fear, not pain, just lightness, as if a weight he had carried for decades was suddenly lifted. He tried to call out to Betsy, but his voice barely left his lips. Instead, his vision blurred, and the room around him faded. And then, silence. Gene felt as though he were drifting, as if his body no longer belonged to him. There was no struggle, no resistance, only the gentle pull of something beyond his understanding. He became aware of a soft glow forming at the edges of his vision. It wasn't the harsh glare of hospital lights or the cold emptiness of the unknown. It was warm, inviting, and familiar. In the distance, he heard voices, whispers, laughter, echoes of memories long forgotten. Faces began to emerge from the light. His mother, his father, old friends who had passed long before him. They stood waiting, smiling, as if welcoming him home. Gene wanted to move toward them, but something held him back. A quiet voice, gentle yet powerful, whispered through the light, "Not yet, Gene. There's more to see." And with that, the journey began. Gene felt himself being drawn forward, weightless and free, as if he had shed not just his body, but every burden he had ever carried. The light ahead of him pulsed gently, neither blinding nor overwhelming, but full of warmth. It wasn't just light, it was alive. It carried whispers of voices he had once known, the echoes of laughter, and the quiet murmur of moments he had long forgotten. As he drifted deeper into this radiant space, something incredible happened. Memories, clearer than they had ever been in life, began to unfold before him like a film reel playing in slow motion. He was 7 years old, standing outside his childhood home in Illinois, feeling the heat of summer beneath his bare feet. He could hear his mother calling him for dinner, the scent of cornbread drifting from the kitchen window. He felt the innocence of those days, the simple joy of a boy who knew nothing of fame, awards, or the weight of the world. Then the scene shifted. He was in his 20s, a young man in the Marines, standing on the deck of a Navy vessel, staring out at the vast ocean. The wind whipped at his face, and he felt the steady rock of the ship beneath his feet. He remembered the uncertainty, the fear of what lay ahead, but also the quiet strength that had carried him through. More memories surfaced. His first audition, the moment he held an Oscar, the night he met Betsy. He saw himself on the set of The French Connection, running through the streets of New York, his heart pounding with adrenaline. He saw the laughter on set during The Birdcage, the friendships formed in the industry, the moments of doubt when he had wondered if he had made the right choices. But then, something changed. The memories became more intimate, more personal. He saw Betsy, her hair tied back, sitting across from him at their kitchen table, laughing at one of his bad jokes. He saw the way she had always looked at him, not as a Hollywood star, but as the man she had chosen to spend her life with. He felt the warmth of her love, the quiet devotion that had remained unshaken through all the years. A lump formed in his throat. He realized that despite all the accolades, all the roles, and all the stories he had helped bring to life, this quiet, ordinary love had been the greatest part of his story. Tears welled in his eyes, but before he could dwell on the emotion, a new presence emerged. A figure bathed in golden light stepped forward. Gene couldn't make out the details of his face, but he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Then came the voice, strong yet gentle, familiar yet unlike anything he had ever heard before. "You have lived well, Gene, but there is still more to understand." The light around him grew brighter. The journey was far from over. Gene felt himself being drawn closer to the glowing figure before him. Though he could not clearly see his face, Gene knew who he was. A deep, abiding peace filled the space around them. Then, as if summoned by the light, figures began to emerge from the golden glow, faces from his past, ones he had not seen in decades. The first was his mother. Her eyes were as kind as he remembered, her hands reaching out to touch his face, though he no longer had a body in the way he once did. She was young again as he remembered her from his childhood, her smile full of warmth. "I've missed you, Ma," Gene whispered. "I never left you, my boy," she said softly. Not once. Tears filled his eyes. He had felt her absence for so many years, but now he realized she had been with him all along. Then came his father, a complicated relationship, one that had carried both love and distance. But now, standing before him, all the unspoken words, all the regrets seemed to melt away. His father placed a hand on Gene's shoulder, a look of quiet pride in his eyes. "You did well, son," he said. A lump formed in Gene's throat. For years he had wondered if his father had ever truly seen him, truly understood the man he had become. And now in the sacred space, there was no need for explanations. The love had always been there. More figures stepped forward. Old friends from Hollywood, Richard Harris, Paul Newman, Robin Williams. They greeted him like old times, their spirits radiant and full of joy. "We've been waiting for you," Robin said with a playful smirk. "But don't get too comfortable yet." Laughter rippled through the group, a warmth Gene had not felt in years. But then the figures parted, and one more soul stepped forward, someone he had never expected to see. A man from his past, a friend he had once wronged. Gene's heart tightened. Regret, the one burden he had not yet released. The man smiled gently. "I forgave you long ago, Gene," he said. "It's time you forgave yourself." Gene's breath hitched. He had carried guilt for so long, but now, standing in the presence of divine love, he felt it loosen its grip on his soul. And then the voice returned. "Are you ready to see the truth, Gene?" The light pulsed around him. The journey was not yet over. The light around Gene grew impossibly bright, yet it did not hurt his eyes. It was warm, like stepping into the embrace of an old friend. He felt weightless, unburdened by time, regret, or the frailties of age. Every moment of his life had led to this place. And then he appeared. Jesus. Not as an image Gene had seen in paintings or churches, but real, radiating an indescribable presence of love, peace, and authority. His eyes, deeper than any ocean, held a knowing gaze, one that saw everything, every triumph, every failure, every unspoken word Gene had ever carried. Yet there was no judgment, only love. Gene felt his knees buckle beneath him, though he was not sure he even had a body in this realm. It was not fear that overwhelmed him. It was reverence, a deep, undeniable awareness that he was in the presence of something far greater than himself. Jesus reached out a hand, gently lifting Gene to his feet. "You have lived well, Gene." The words filled every part of his being, resonating like music through his soul. Gene's mind raced. There was so much he wanted to ask, so much he didn't understand. "Why am I here?" Gene found himself asking. Jesus smiled, his expression patient and kind. "Because it is time to see beyond the curtain." Suddenly, the space around them shifted. It was as if the fabric of existence itself peeled back, revealing scenes Gene had never seen before, yet somehow they were his own life. He watched himself as a child, sitting alone after his father had left their family. He had felt abandoned, unwanted. But now, from this perspective, he saw something else. A presence beside him, even then. A warm glow, unseen at the time, had surrounded him. "I was never alone," Gene whispered. Jesus nodded. "Never." More scenes unfolded, moments Gene had long forgotten, times he had shown kindness without realizing its impact. A struggling young actor he had encouraged. A fan he had taken the time to speak to when no one else had. A small act of generosity that had changed someone's life. "I didn't know those things mattered," Gene admitted. Jesus turned to him, his gaze both gentle and firm. "Every act of love matters, Gene. Nothing is forgotten." Tears filled Gene's eyes. He had spent his life believing his legacy was in his films, in the awards and accolades. But now, standing before eternal truth, he realized his true legacy was love. But then, another scene appeared. Betsy. She was still in their home, kneeling beside his body. Her shoulders trembled as she held his hand. Their dogs lay quietly beside her, as if they too understood the weight of this moment. A deep longing filled Gene's soul. He wanted to reach out, to tell her he was still here, that he loved her. Jesus placed a hand on Gene's shoulder. "Love does not end, Gene, but there is one last thing to see." The scene changed once more. Now he saw the world beyond this place, a realm so breathtaking, so vivid, that it made Earth seem like a shadow by comparison. Colors beyond human understanding painted the sky, and music, not heard with ears, but felt in the soul, filled the air. It was home. Gene felt an overwhelming pull toward it. Peace. Pure, endless peace. But then, Jesus turned to him. "You have a choice, Gene. You may stay, or you may go back." Gene hesitated. He had seen, he had understood. But could he really leave Betsy without saying goodbye? He looked back at her, still crying, still holding his hand. "She's not ready," he whispered. Jesus smiled knowingly. "Then go, Gene. But remember, love is the only thing that truly lasts." And with that, everything faded to white. Gene felt himself being pulled backward, away from the golden horizon of eternity. The peace, the love, the absolute rightness of that place. It was slipping from his grasp. A part of him wanted to resist, to stay in that realm of warmth where time had no meaning, where his soul felt whole. But then he saw her. Betsy, still kneeling beside his body, her hands trembling as she stroked his hair. Her lips moved in silent prayer, her eyes filled with grief. Gene's heart ached. He had seen the truth, that love never truly dies, that the soul moves on. But she hadn't seen it yet. To her, he was gone. To her, the love they had built, the years they had spent side by side, had just ended. She wasn't ready to let go. And Gene knew in that moment, neither was he. The light around him pulsed gently, as if understanding his decision. He felt a familiar presence beside him, Jesus watching him with infinite patience. "You understand now, don't you?" Gene nodded. "Love doesn't end, but sometimes the ones left behind need time to see it." Jesus smiled. "Then go back, Gene, and leave her something to remember." Before Gene could ask what that meant, everything shifted. The warmth of the eternal realm faded. The golden light grew dimmer. The sounds of divine music softened, and suddenly, Gene felt heavy. His chest ached, his lungs strained. A dull, rhythmic beeping filled his ears. He was back, For a moment he couldn't move. His eyes remained closed, but he could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him again. His body was weak, exhausted, yet alive. And then something warm wrapped around his hand. Betsy. She gasped, feeling his fingers twitch beneath hers. "Gene?" Her voice cracked with disbelief. He forced his eyelids open, his vision blurry. But there she was, her face streaked with tears, her expression one of pure, unfiltered relief. "You came back," she whispered. Gene swallowed, his throat dry. He didn't have the strength for a long explanation, for telling her all that he had seen. But somehow he knew she would understand in time. Instead, he just smiled weakly and whispered back, "Love never ends." At that moment, a gentle breeze swept through the open window, rustling the framed photographs on the nightstand. One picture, their wedding photo, tilted slightly, as if touched by unseen hands. Betsy saw it, a soft gasp escaping her lips. She looked back at Gene, her tears now mixed with something else, understanding. Gene knew then that the message had been received. He had come back, but the truth remained. One day, when the time was right, they would meet again. The days that followed were quiet. Gene remained weak, but his mind had never been clearer. He no longer feared death, nor did he question what lay beyond. He had seen it, he had felt it, and now he understood. Betsy rarely left his side. She didn't ask too many questions at first. She simply held his hand, made sure he ate, and watched over him like she always had. But Gene knew she sensed something different about him. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the Santa Fe hills, Betsy finally spoke. "You were gone," she said softly. "I felt it. I knew you were gone." Gene nodded, his voice steady but gentle. "I was." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. "And now you're here." He reached for her hand, squeezing it lightly. "For now." A tear slipped down her cheek, but this time there was no fear in her expression. There was sadness, yes, but also something deeper. Understanding. "I don't know how much time I have left, Bets," Gene admitted, "but I know this. It won't be the end. When that day comes, you'll feel me, just like you did before." Betsy inhaled sharply, then nodded. "I already do." They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the gentle rustling of the wind outside. Gene let his eyes drift to their wedding photo on the nightstand, the same one that had tilted the day he returned. He smiled. He didn't need to explain the details of what he had seen, the golden light, the voices of loved ones, Jesus standing beside him, because Betsy already understood the most important part. Love had carried him there, and love had brought him back. One day when it was her time, love would carry her too. Betsy reached out and ran a hand through his hair, just as she had that night when she thought she had lost him forever. But now she knew better. "You rest now," she whispered. Gene closed his eyes, exhaling slowly, peacefully. He wasn't afraid, he wasn't worried, because he had seen what waited on the other side, and it was beautiful. The days passed gently, each one feeling like a gift. Gene no longer feared what was coming. He welcomed it with a quiet understanding. He spent his time with Betsy, sitting by the window as the desert sky stretched endlessly before them. The sunset seemed deeper, richer, more vibrant than ever before. One evening, as the last traces of daylight faded into twilight, Gene felt it, a pull, a whisper, a calling. He knew. Betsy must have sensed it too, because she reached for his hand without saying a word. They sat together, fingers entwined, in the kind of silence that only comes from a lifetime of knowing each other's hearts. Gene turned to her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you remember what I told you?" She nodded, blinking back tears. "That love never ends." A soft smile touched his lips. "That's right." Betsy held his hand tighter, as if memorizing the warmth of it. She wasn't ready to say goodbye, but this time she knew it wasn't really goodbye at all. Gene let out a slow breath, his body growing lighter, his heart at peace. Then, ever so softly, he closed his eyes. A stillness settled over the room. Betsy sat beside him for a long time, her hands still wrapped around his. She felt no fear, no darkness, only an overwhelming sense of peace. A gentle breeze drifted through the open window, rustling the curtains. The wedding photo on the nightstand tilted once more, as if touched by unseen hands. Betsy smiled through her tears. He was here. He would always be here. Outside, the stars began to appear, one by one, their glow endless and eternal. Just like love. The house was quiet now, wrapped in the kind of stillness that felt almost sacred. Betsy remained by Gene's side, her fingers still resting gently against his. There was no panic, no sorrow that could not be soothed, only the deep, abiding knowledge that he had gone home. She looked toward the window where the wind had settled into a soft whisper. The desert sky stretched wide above her, stars blinking against the endless black, as if signaling a quiet message from beyond. Gene had told her he would always be here, and she believed him. In the coming days, the world would hear the news. A Hollywood legend had passed. They would speak of his films, his awards, his unforgettable presence on screen. They would remember Popeye Doyle, Little Bill, and countless other characters who had shaped American cinema. But Betsy would remember the man, the husband who made her laugh on quiet mornings, the storyteller who held her hand on long walks, the soul who had looked beyond this life and returned, if only for a little while, just to remind her of one simple truth: love never ends. She exhaled, slowly wiping the last of her tears. Then, with a full heart, she whispered into the quiet night, "I'll see you again, my love." And somewhere beyond time and space, beyond the stars and the golden horizon of eternity, Gene Hackman smiled. Gene Hackman's story is more than the life of a Hollywood legend. It is a reminder of something far greater, the reality that love, faith, and the soul itself are eternal. Many who have experienced near-death experiences, NDEs, speak of a light, a presence, and an overwhelming sense of peace. Some see loved ones waiting for them. Others encounter Jesus, just as Gene did. They return with a deep knowing that this life is only a chapter, not the whole story. For those left behind, grief is real. Betsy felt the weight of loss, just as so many do when a loved one crosses over, but she also felt something else: his presence, his love, his message that love never ends. Maybe you too have lost someone dear. Maybe you wonder where they are now. If Gene's journey tells us anything, it's that they are not truly gone. They are just beyond the veil, waiting, watching, and loving us still. One day when our time comes, we will step into that golden light and see them again. Until then, we hold on to what Gene understood in the end: love never ends.